The prisoner's eyes suddenly went wide, locked on something straight ahead, as if he'd spotted something off near the cell door. To confirm whether his hunch was right, Andy waited until mealtime, then casually shifted his gaze and fixed his attention once again on that metal spoon. At that very moment, a guard unlocked the cell door from outside. Andy quietly slid the spoon into the shadows, gave it a gentle nudge forward with his foot, and then deliberately set his food tray in the frontmost spot. But anyone watching closely would have noticed that Andy didn't pull his right foot back right away. Instead, he kept it discreetly positioned in front of the spoon. Surprisingly, the guard who came to collect the dishes seemed completely oblivious to anything unusual. He picked up the tray and turned to leave. No one realized that this seemingly trivial slip-up would eventually become a stain on the prison's reputation that could never be wiped away. Andy didn't dare waste a second. He immediately grabbed the spoon handle and started grinding it furiously against the floor. After a good deal of effort, a reworked spoon finally took shape. Eager to test it out, he gave it just a light pry, and the wooden panel on the cell door popped loose almost instantly. Staring at the gaping hole now in front of him, Andy felt a bold plan begin to form in his mind. But he quickly realized it was still daytime, and a guard could come around to patrol at any moment. To avoid being exposed, he didn't dare make a rash move and had no choice but to stash the spoon away first. Only after night fell did Andy spring back into action. Using the sharpened spoon handle, he carefully dug along the seam, bit by bit widening the opening. To keep from getting caught, he stayed on high alert the entire time. Roughly every 2 minutes, Andy would freeze and listen intently for any movement in the hallway. At the slightest sound, he'd stop immediately, and only once he was sure the coast was clear would he resume. As careful as Andy was, the faint scraping noises that kept drifting out eventually caught the attention of a fellow inmate. To Andy's surprise, the man not only refrained from ratting him out, he actually offered to help. Even better, the inmate's cell happened to be directly across from his, giving him a clear view of the hallway. With this guy's cooperation, Andy no longer had to worry about a guard showing up unannounced, even when he worked during the day. But as the opening grew larger, a new problem cropped up. Andy sat by the window puzzling over it for a long while before finally hitting on a solution. He rolled up some paper, coated it in dust, soaked it in water, then squeezed out the excess and kneaded it between his hands into a long strip. Once everything was ready, he carefully packed the paper strips into the seam. Camouflaged this way, the surface of the panel looked almost completely normal, enough to slip past the guard's daily inspections. Just when he thought his plan was foolproof, something unexpected happened. As Andy was about to keep working, footsteps suddenly sounded outside. He quickly hid his tools in his clothes and pretended to put his handcuffs back on. A moment later, the guard opened the cell door and let him out. Anxious and uneasy, Andy could do nothing but follow the guard slowly up the stairs. But when he was brought to the upper floor, he was stunned to discover he'd been assigned to a brand new cell. Just like that, nearly all his earlier work had gone to waste. As frustrated as he felt, he had no choice but to accept reality. In the days that followed, Andy went right back to his old routine. But having been burned once, he became even more cautious. He even carefully dealt with the wood shavings scattered outside the door, doing everything he could to leave no trace behind. At the same time, he reached out again to the inmate across the way, offering the hope of getting free in exchange for the man's help keeping watch. With that arrangement in place, he soon reopened the original seam. Once everything was set, he started pushing forward to the next stage. But reality proved tougher than he'd imagined. The wooden panel was unusually hard, and despite repeated efforts, it didn't budge. Instead, his spoon snapped clean in two. Even so, Andy refused to give up. He wrapped the tool in a towel and tried prying the panel again, but still made no headway. Only after realizing this approach was a dead end did he finally stop. And just when he had no idea what to do next, things took a turn for the better. During yard time, Andy happened to spot a few spoons left behind on a windowsill, and without a second thought, he swiped one. This time, he wrapped the broken spoon in a towel ahead of time, and the moment he confirmed there was no movement outside, he got to work. Having an extra tool on hand gave him a bit more confidence. He figured things would go more smoothly this time, but he ended up putting in too much force, and instead of prying the panel open, he knocked off a big chunk of wood. The sight gave Andy a real scare. To avoid being discovered, he hurriedly put the broken piece back in place, even picking up the wood shavings that had fallen to the floor one by one and carefully tucking them back into the seam. To cover up the marks, he disguised them with a pencil. Still not reassured, he ended up fixing a nail to the door so that a towel could serve as an even more concealing cover. Once he'd finished this whole round of damage control, Andy had no choice but to keep scraping away at the panel little by little. Finally, one day, he managed to widen the seam enough and the panel came off smoothly, but he didn't act right away. Instead, he forced down his excitement and put the panel back exactly as it had been. When night came, Andy carefully leaned out, and only after confirming everything around him was quiet did he quietly crawl through the hole. But he didn't go far. Instead, he tiptoed over to the cell across the way to share the big news with his fellow inmate, then quickly slipped back to his own cell. The next day, during the morning wash-up, Andy secretly passed along the method for removing the panel to his fellow inmate. Meanwhile, Andy didn't slow down himself. At night, He kept going out to familiarize himself with the prison's layout, trying to find the safest possible escape route. After several days of observation, he finally settled on escaping over the roof, but a 3-story drop made jumping straight down all but impossible, so he started thinking about making a rope strong enough to hold him. Andy soon came up with a way. He lifted the mattress to expose the wire frame holding the bed together, then used a tool to gradually pry loose the nails fixing it in place, pulling out the crisscrossing wires bit by bit. Mindful of keeping the bed looking normal, he left only a small amount of wire in place for support. Once he had the wire, he cut open the fabric of his backpack and trimmed it into long strips, then folded each strip's ends around the wire and slowly wove them together. Bit by bit, a rope with enough strength gradually took shape. When everything was ready, Andy went right away to check on his fellow inmates' progress. To his surprise, the man had run into trouble. He said the original method wasn't enough to open his cell door. With no other option, the inmate had come up with a different plan and written it down on a slip of paper for Andy. Back in his cell, Andy immediately pulled out the note to read it. But once he'd finished, he quickly rejected the plan his fellow inmate had proposed. Then, the very next day, he was horrified to discover that the inmate had been taken away for interrogation. After the man was returned, the moment Andy tried to get even slightly closer to talk, a guard would immediately drive him away. From then on, the two completely lost any chance to communicate. Unable to keep track of the other man's progress, Andy could only resign himself to being cut off. Then, during one yard period, Andy noticed that something was clearly wrong with his fellow inmate. A wave of uneasy foreboding washed over him, and he hurried to follow behind and watch, but he could never get close. He could only stare from a distance. Soon after they entered the yard, the inmate suddenly broke from the group and bolted toward a corner of the wall. Andy knew the man's cell door had never opened, which meant he'd gone ahead with his own plan after all. Now all Andy could do was pray he'd make it out, but reality didn't play out the way anyone hoped. The inmate was caught and dragged back in no time. Still, this incident gave Andy a crucial piece of intelligence. Behind the roof, there were actually 2 towering walls. The inmate had been trapped right there, which was why he'd finally been subdued. Only then did Andy realize that the wire rope in his hands was nowhere near enough to clear these 2 obstacles. But for the moment, he couldn't come up with a new solution. Just as he was stuck, a fellow inmate on the first floor lent him a hand. Back in his cell, Andy couldn't wait to open the note the man had passed him, and after reading it carefully, hope reignited in his heart. He wasted no time getting to work. Using a bedboard as a makeshift ladder, he smoothly removed the cover of the light fixture, loosened the mounting screws with the spoon handle, and quietly hid the glass panel he'd taken down inside his bedding. Once he confirmed no one was around, Andy carefully stepped on the glass to break it, then disposed of all the fragments in the waste bucket, dumping them down the drain the next day when he got the chance. After clearing away these traces, he used the metal frame of the light fixture to fashion 4 hooks, then connected them in pairs with wire. Only after repeatedly testing them to confirm they could bear his weight did he secretly hide these tools by the window. But just as he was about to move forward with the next stage of his plan, something unexpected happened. That day, when Andy came back from yard time, he found that a new cellmate had been moved in. Caught off guard and unable to judge whether the man could be trusted, he had no choice but to put everything on hold. Andy had originally planned to observe for a while, gradually getting a read on the man's personality and habits before deciding whether to keep moving forward. But after only a few days, he was suddenly taken away by a guard. Anxious and confused, he was brought to the warden's office. He'd assumed it was just a routine questioning, but what awaited him was the announcement of a death sentence. Worse still, the execution date was set for just 1 week later. The news left Andy frozen on the spot. He never imagined the verdict would come so fast, and the shadow of death fell over him in an instant. Under this crushing pressure, Andy made an almost crazed decision. Back in his cell, he quietly hid the iron hook under the bed, then fixed his cellmate with a hostile stare. But when he saw that the man was sound asleep, Andy's resolve began to waver. He'd meant to seize the chance to get rid of his cellmate, but in the end, he couldn't bring himself to do it. As the execution date crept closer day by day, Andy decided to take a gamble and told his cellmate about his escape plan. But after hearing him out, the cellmate thought it was nearly impossible to pull off. And if they failed and got dragged back, he might even get caught up in the fallout himself. Andy, though, had clearly come prepared. To put the man's doubts to rest, he showed off the results of his work over the past days right then and there, and walked him through the planned escape route in detail. After seeing all these preparations, the cellmate finally came around and chose to join the plan. So the two of them immediately started working together. Using his status as a newcomer, the cellmate requested fresh bedding and blankets from the guards. And then the two of them tore the material into strips and slowly wove the strips into a sturdy rope. With the cellmate's help, preparations that would normally have taken days were finished in just half a day. The two of them then decided to make their move that very night. To leave nothing to chance, Andy personally demonstrated how to walk before dark, aiming to land without a sound and leave no trace of movement. After night fell, the two climbed silently onto the roof and inched forward step by step along the route they'd practiced in advance. When they reached the edge of the roof, Andy didn't act right away. Instead, he had his partner stay put while he carefully poked his head out to scope out the situation below. Sure enough, an armed guard was patrolling back and forth down below. Andy had planned to wait until the man let his guard down, but as the minutes ticked by, he couldn't find a good opening. Just when he was on the verge of despair, the break he'd been waiting for finally came. The exhausted guard suddenly stopped, sat down, and got ready to rest. Andy didn't dare hesitate. He immediately woke his sleeping cellmate. The two quickly lowered the rope and Andy went first, climbing down it without a sound. Even after his feet touched the ground, he kept moving slowly on his tiptoes, doing everything he could to stay silent, terrified of startling the resting guard. Then Andy made his way cautiously along the wall. When he reached the corner, he didn't act immediately. Instead, he pressed his hand hard against his chest, forcing himself to calm his pounding heart. Once he'd steadied himself a bit, he gritted his teeth and made a run for it. About 3 minutes later, Andy finally reappeared in view, and only then did his cellmate slip quietly down the rope. The two then worked together seamlessly and successfully scaled the other towering wall. Right after, they crept along the rooftop and finally reached the edge of the wall, the very spot where their fellow inmate had been caught. Andy grew even more vigilant, carefully poking his head out to survey the scene. Just as the inmate had said, ahead of them was a passage formed by 2 walls, with guards on bicycles patrolling past again and again. Playing it safe, Andy didn't act right away. Instead, he quietly observed the intervals between the guards' patrols. Once he'd fully figured out the pattern, he seized the gap, quickly flung the hooked rope from his hand, and snagged the wall on the far side with pinpoint accuracy. After confirming the other end was firmly anchored, Andy reinforced the rope with a second hook on his side. With that, a simple rope crossing was complete. The two of them then lay low and waited until the guards had finished another round of patrol before quickly climbing across along the rope. Luckily, the rope made from bedsheets was strong enough. Andy made it to the other side without a hitch and successfully dropped down the final wall. There, he forced down his excitement and helped his cellmate down as well. With no time to celebrate, the two hurried off into the distance and soon vanished into the vast darkness of the night.